Hey everyone, welcome to lecture two. I'm waiting to catch a flight back home after a meeting here in Daytona Beach. I'm at the airport and I've got this kind of jazzish punk or pop rock background noise that's probably coming through the recording there. Yeah, we'll just roll with it here. Life on the road. Today we're going to talk in lecture two. You're going to get that as well, announcements. We're going to talk about the historical revolution of international relations, and what we're going to do is provide you a really sort of high-level overview of some major historical events as it pertains to international relations. A few of these are going to be ones that come up repeatedly over the course sort of the semester as we look at the various models. But it's kind of important to kind of go through them and to discuss this history a little bit, particularly as it relates to intergovernmental organizations, which we're going to talk about more later in the course. Organizations such as the United Nations, and understanding sort of the historical precedent that really sort of drove the creation of these organizations. So let's go ahead and get started. So the earliest examples of international relations actually go back pretty far, in fact, to the earliest sort of records we have of human history. In fact, you can see the earliest known treaty occurred in Mesopotamia around 3100 BC. So Mesopotamia would be kind of modern-day Iraq. Mesopotamia, if I remember from my history class, means what does that mean? Land between two rivers? Yeah, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And this initial agreement delineated geographic borders. So we can at least see that there were concerns about sort of territorial areas and creating sort of legal distinctions there very early on. We see the Egyptian Hittite peace treaty of 1259 BC. Actually, it still exists. It was written onto a wall. They took a similar approach to my kids when they were toddlers of just writing important stuff on the wall. And this is the longest surviving peace treaty that we know about in the world. So some pretty cool history here. Some of the earliest precursors to what we now know of as international law, which will be discussed again a little bit further, and I think we get that in the second half of the class, can actually be found in some of the early Islamic laws governing military conduct and the protection of prisoners. That goes back to around 700 AD. So you can see very detailed instructions about what could and couldn't be done to prisoners during a conflict. So pretty interesting that sort of a framework for some of these ideas was being thought of in some of the earliest civilizations. Now, as you might imagine, trade was really the sort of principal factor that dominated a lot of early international policy here. And one of the biggest sort of catalysts of international relations was really the fall of the Holy Roman Empire. Because what you did, or what that did rather, was take essentially a geographically large territory that covered most of what we consider modern-day Europe and into the Middle East and Africa, and split it into a bunch of different territories. So economic self-interest really drove policies to facilitate international trade. Again, as our sort of international reach starts to expand, you've got different civilizations that have access to different resources that we may need, and then an abundance of resources in our own civilizations or areas or regions that we need to export. So during this time, many Italian city-states, for instance, ended up developing what's been sort of acknowledged to be the first diplomatic corps. Started sending ambassadors to foreign capitals to essentially negotiate trade agreements that put themselves at an advantage over other Italian city-states that they might have had conflict with. And again, so much of this is a result of the decentralization of the government that occurs because the Holy Roman Empire, has sort of largely collapsed. Now these independent city-states essentially have more autonomy. So this all sort of culminates in what was generally considered to be the first great European war, and great in the sense of it was big, not so much in that it did any good. This would be the 30 Years' War. So it occurred, get this, over 30 years, from 1618 to 1648, generally in these territories that the Holy Roman Empire had largely sort of abandoned. And this was mostly a function of just increasing sectionalism, particularly among Catholics and Protestants. So one of the sort of things that repeats itself quite frequently in history, if you go back to the Iraq War invasion. So Certainly there's evidence that Saddam Hussein committed atrocities and was a true sort of dictator in the worst sense. But one of the indirect byproducts of his style of rule was that it generally maintained a peace between, the various factions, Islamic factions in Iraq, and then also with the Kurds in the north. It had provided some degree of protection there. So, interestingly enough, this tyranny sort of at least maintained internal peace within Iraq. Once that government was toppled by the United States, you started to see a lot of sectionalist violence start to emerge here. And this is kind of what's going on during the 30-Year War. And you've got this distinction, of course, between the Catholics and Protestants. Most of you are probably familiar with the history of Protestantism and its growth, and Martin Luther and his role in it there. It's really interesting part of world history there. We're not going to go through all the details right now, but most of continental Europe, as we know it, was split essentially between 300 imperial states, and each of these states had varying degrees of power, whether it be through resources or military or what have you there. So the 30 Years' War essentially saw most of these 300 imperial states take sides and go to battle with one another, and of course it lasted a long time. By the best estimates that we have is that almost somewhere between 4.5 to 8 million people died as a result of this conflict. Eventually it's resolved by what's known as the Peace of Westphalia, and there's many different peace agreements and that sort of thing that occur during this part of civilization, but this ends up being one of the most important because it formally recognizes for the first time this concept of sovereignty here. So the duck has an interruption here. He says, wait, was the 30 Years' War about religion, or is that just an excuse for various kingdoms to go to war over other matters? Very astute, and I'm sure you guys all have a lot of opinions about the 30 Years' War, but he's sort of right to question this because historians have as well. So if you look at the conflict, it was largely attributed to the Protestant Reformation, and each kingdom and the king or the ruler over each kingdom had the ability to decide which religion to sort of ascribe to or to have their kingdom ascribe to. But this was really sort of a catalyst for this conflict. And in large part, if you look at the evidence, there's evidence that just suggests that it was really more about power, like so many wars, expanding one's territory, resources, reach. Again, we see evidence that cites these religious reasons, but historians have generally agreed that the 30 Years' War was probably at least equally, tied to the fact that these various kingdoms, in the absence of the Holy Roman Empire, were essentially vying for power and more land and territory there. So let's get back to the Peace of Westphalia. Sorry, I get interrupted each time trying to figure out what song just came on the radio. It's been such a weird mix. I would expect nothing less of Daytona Beach. So let's go back to the significance of the Peace of Westphalia here. It not only ended this bloody conflict, but it ushered in this principle of sovereignty, where for the first time we have a legal recognition that these are your borders and you have the power to control that. These are mine. Let's sort of steer clear of each other. It gave the first sort of legitimacy to this idea that another state has the ability to govern itself. Generally the feeling in Europe at the time was that the 30 Years' War had done very little to help anyone. The accompanying treaties, not only this one but others, recognized legitimacy of these 300 different Germanic states that emerged from the Holy Roman Empire, but also took the step of more or less acknowledging an inherent equality across them, that one wasn't more sovereign than the other, that sovereignty was more of sort of a binary thing, like you had it or you didn't there. This ends up laying the groundwork for a society of states in Europe, which countries formed agreements based on their mutual interests, values, and norms. And so really the significance of the Peace of Westphalia is twofold. First, it identifies formally this concept of sovereignty, and then it also lays really sort of the groundwork for what will become the first intergovernmental organization. So really sort of the basis for this. So we're going to talk a little bit more, and we're going to skip ahead here a little bit. We're going to get into the 20th century, because we start to see a lot of movement in terms of international relations policy then. But let's talk first about this rise of self-determination. So you didn't really sort of get a philosophical kind of take or acknowledgement of the rights of the governed or the rights of citizens really until 1205 Magna Carta, and this really didn't gain traction though until the modern era of philosophical thought. That's if you've taken my American government class, we've talked a little bit about this because this includes the period of the social contract theorists. They were hugely influential in the development of the U.S. Constitution. So if you take my American government class, we'll talk about that. This sort of led to the formal acknowledgement of governing power being bestowed by those governed. So as opposed to, in an effort to get away from the monarchy-style system that had ruled Western cultures in Europe in particular for so long, really the social contract theorists are arguing that no, a ruler is placed in power through the consent of the governed there. This ended up having the effect of increasing a focus on national self-determination, or this belief that nationalist groups should govern their own states. So remember when we talked last week about nationalism to a certain extent, or the concept of a nation. What is a nation? Well, it's essentially people with a shared culture. And for much of modern history, people were ruled by those who didn't necessarily share their national identity. So again, the Holy Roman Empire is a good example as they expanded that territory, but really even coming out of that, there was a lot of conflict that sort of emerged from this challenge. So we skip, even further ahead. This brings us into kind of the period leading up to World War I in the 20th century here. Generally, 4 reasons are cited by historians for the start of World War I, and I'll go through each of those here. One is militarism. So you had new technologies that allowed militaries to grow in power. In fact, the innovation of certain weapons like the machine gun, the aircraft, and the tank, really sort of even the playing field, quite literally in World War I, to the extent that you had years of trench warfare where neither side could really advance because technology had sort of made those militaries so equivalent essentially. You had the rise in imperialism, so these European empires continued to compete for colonial expansion, again, as they could reach further and further places on the globe and had greater need for resources here. Imperialism from European empires continued to be an issue. You had the alliance system. So one of the interesting things is, and we'll talk about this as we go through the course, countries form alliances for their own self-protection, but oftentimes the consequence of that is that it sort of can stoke the fires of animosity with other countries that might not be in that alliance or those that belong to separate alliances. So you saw this alliance, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente form, that would essentially end up being the 2 sides of World War I, and really through these agreements, and again, you can look at it in a contemporary example where Ukraine's desire to join NATO is really had sort of a backlash response in terms of Russia kind of retaliating at the threat of that occurring. And then, of course, rising nationalism, which will end up being like really the biggest factor driving World War I. Self-determination that we just talked about led to smaller, more nationalistic countries that had a greater sense of self-identity and less amenable to being subject to the rule or influence of neighboring nations. So as I talked about, nationalism was quite huge in sort of kickstarting World War I. This nationalist fervor had grown pretty rampant, particularly in the Balkan nations of Eastern Europe that were controlled by the Austria-Hungary Empire. So again, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was rather large. It was a multinational empire, meaning that there were many national groups that were controlled by this empire. Which naturally led to a lot of conflict here. Eventually, this culminated in the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who you see pictured here, by Serbian nationalist groups. In response to that, you had the shelling of Belgrade and attacks on the Serbian nationals. How did this result in the beginning of World War I? Well, Russia had previously made an obligation to defend Serbia. And in doing so, they had formed this alliance previously with Great Britain and France, and so Great Britain and France got pulled into it as well, after the German invasion of neutral Belgium. So you had these alliances that had formed. You had this this act of nationalism, which led to international conflict, and these alliances were essentially obligated to come to the aid of their alliance members. So ultimately, and we're going to skip through the history of World War One, which is disappointing because I love World War One history, and I wish I could teach a class on just that. But at the end of World War One, you have the Treaty of Versailles, and that ended the war officially and created what was known as the League of Nations. And in doing so, the League of Nations became really the first intergovernmental organization, which we'll spend a lot of time in this class talking about here. The League of Nations specifically called out, what are the rights and obligations of the war's victors and those defeated. So moving forward, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again, and how do we sort of rebuild the economies of those countries that were decimated by the war there. The League of Nations existed largely from 1920, right at the end of the war, rather, to 1946, essentially the beginning of World War II. At its peak, 58 member nations were a part of this. Now, notably, the United States ended up refusing to join, and this was largely reflective of a policy of non-interventionism that was predominant among American politicians and citizens. We're over here. Why do we want to get involved in Europe's mess? We have no direct interest in that. That very much ran counter to sort of the goals and objectives of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. I got to give you a code word before I forget, so we'll make it Woodrow Wilson as your code word. I like to use him because he was the only U.S. president to have been a political scientist. I think he was Princeton-educated political scientist, if I remember correctly. So Woodrow Wilson, use that as your code word. He was really instrumental in creating the League of Nations, but he couldn't actually get the United States to join, and he was elected out of office did he pass away in office? Gosh, I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyways, he wasn't in office. He was replaced, and the U.S. did not pursue entry into the League of Nations again. As I mentioned, the League of Nations existed from 1920 to really the start of World War II here. And the primary goal of the League of Nations was to ensure that there was never another major European land conflict. Well, clearly they failed, because World War II occurred. And so this was really the beginning of the end for the League of Nations. What they sort of discovered, and historians have pointed to, is that the League itself lacked the ability to enforce any of its directives. And this is going to be a prevailing theme in this class, this idea of even this concept of international law, that you can tell a country what they can or can't do, but unless you have a military to back it up, there's no essential consequence for violating that, other than maybe some trade agreements and other things like that. The League of Nations lacked the ability to enforce that, and individual member states were reluctant to dedicate forces to this end. So again, it had just gotten out of World War I. Countries weren't thrilled about the idea of sending their troops into greater conflict as an effort to avoid war. The League at one point advocated for disarmament, with two of its largest members, the United Kingdom and France, were essentially unwilling to do so because Russia and Germany weren't a part of the League of Nations, and so there was no guarantee that they would do the same thing. And so politicians and residents of the UK and France saw that as weakening themselves at the expense of other powers at the time here. And as I mentioned, the United States failed to join the League, which really left kind of the world's fastest emerging superpower kind of out of the mix there. So then on comes the Great Depression here. So, at the end of World War I, Japan and the United States really sort of emerge as kind of the big superpowers, because they were largely unscathed from the war. The U.S. got involved, but it was very late, and Japan had its own conflict with China, but really World War I sort of bypassed these two countries here. So their economies were chugging along, small exposure during the war. In fact, their economies actually really sort of fueled the war in a lot of ways, because they were sending arms to those countries fighting through the Entente or the Alliance. So in 1929, you have the stock market crash, and this sets forth a chain of events that really sort of reshapes the entirety of the remainder of the 20th century here. What had happened is, these countries, really the world had made so many gains, including the losers of World War One, namely Germany. They had reestablished their economy and they were rebuilding their economy. When the U.S. stock market crashed, what happened was that U.S. banks that had loaned money to Germany had to basically call in those loans, demanding that Germany repay those loans. As a result of this, the German mark, their form of currency, lost almost all of its value there, and their economy plummeted. Placed great financial stress on Germany, really at the time when they were still rebuilding here. And what occurs during this time period is you have this national discontent with the state of the economy, the concessions Germany has made, and that leads to the rise of the National Socialist German Workers' Party in Germany. So Duck jumps in here. He says, "Hold up! Are you claiming that the Nazis, the National Socialist Party, there came about because of the U.S. stock market crash? That's a bit of a leap in logic, isn't it? Here, well, it's really not if you think about it. So the Nazi Party had actually existed in some form for nearly a decade and a half prior to seizing power in Germany, really without much support. And in fact, when they did end up, garnering a minimum level of support to initiate the changes that we saw coming into World War II. They only did so with, I believe it was around 31% of the vote in Parliament. So they were still very much a minority group here. They had this agenda, that was built upon a few different things, including, unfortunately, anti-Semitism, blaming German Jews and others for the country's problems. So again, in what you'll find, and we'll talk about this quite a bit in this course, is that these sentiments of nationalism and then xenophobia, which I'll talk about here in a second, which is nationalism that essentially becomes animosity towards other groups, very much rises during periods of economic uncertainty when people are looking for a group or something to blame for their challenges here. So when the U.S. and European banks called back their loans to the German government, it decimated the economy. The question is, would such events, the events of World War II and the Holocaust, have occurred had the U.S. stock market not crashed? I think, having read on this, historians suggest perhaps at a later point in time it would have delayed sort of these economic challenges, but that it might not have been enough to, allow us to avoid this altogether. But sort of an interesting connection when we talk about globalization and the impacts of events in one country and how they influence things across the globe. This is unfortunately a pretty good example. So, nationalism again becomes the case in World War II as it did in World War I. I mentioned the Nazi Party was pretty unpopular through the 1920s, but then the Nazis ended up gaining power in 1933 during this global recession, and they appointed Adolf Hitler as their chancellor. So, what Hitler did, which is very commensurate with political fascism, is that he immediately, dictated that all other political parties were illegal, that only the Nazi Party could represent Germany, and began essentially censoring political opposition. So, other political leaders, the media, the press, and that censorship, came in the form of arrests and, eventually, executions, unfortunately, for those that disagreed with him, which is, again, very commensurate. We'll talk a little bit more about fascist movements at a later point, too. But as I mentioned here, there's a point where nationalism sort of transforms into something, very negative and volatile, and we refer to that as xenophobia, and that's a fear or hatred of other nationalities, and it manifested itself, quite vividly during this time period. Not only anti-Semitism, but also anti-Marxist rhetoric and actions during this time period as well. Leading up to World War II, so the Nazi Party, I think a lot of people, particularly if you just watch World War II documentaries, they don't do a good job of focusing on the fact that the Nazi Party existed in power for several years before World War II, and was really legitimized, by the U.S. government and others who acknowledged the sovereignty of the German state and Hitler's rule. In fact, in the United States, it was not uncommon during this time period to have American sympathizers with the Nazi Party. Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, was known to be a large Nazi Party supporter, sympathizer. Lord Baden-Powell of Boy Scout fame actually has some, Nazi sympathizing sentiments that he sort of shared over time. Although once World War II began, he sort of you know uh, backed out of those statements and support, just to give him credit here. As German power grew, Hitler reclaimed a lot of the German territories seized in the Treaty of Versailles here, seeking to avoid further conflict. The problem was that other European countries largely didn't respond. In fact, the UK and France engaged in this policy of what we call appeasement. So essentially allowing Hitler and the Germans to reclaim these territories in an effort to avoid future conflict and hopefully further expansion here. Ultimately, this policy fails because the Germans end up violating repeated territorial agreements and ended up invading Western Europe entirely, beginning in Poland in 1939. Example of this, for instance, so you've got Germany expanding and the Allies, particularly the UK and France, struggling to find a way to ensure their own protection here. Eventually, they invite Hitler to the Munich Agreement in 1938, or actually technically Hitler invited them. So you see this photo here. It's interesting. On the far left, you've got Neville Chamberlain, who was the UK Prime Minister at the time. You've got the Prime Minister of France next to Hitler. On his left is Benito Mussolini, the fascist ruler of Italy there. So the Munich Agreement, signed in 1938, was largely based on German terms, was signed by Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, and essentially ceded portions of Czechoslovakia and Poland to the Germans. And in doing so, there was a promise that essentially the Germans would stop their expansion, and they would leave it at that. Well, less than a year later, Germany violated the agreement by claiming essentially all of Poland before expanding throughout the entirety of Western Europe and Scandinavia. So as you know, eventually the Germans ended up taking France and had initiated a plan to overtake Great Britain as well. To the south, they'd expanded all the way into northern Africa and really to the east to the Russian border. So we're skipping again a lot of history here, but after World War II, so the Germans are defeated. We haven't really talked about the conflict in Japan because it's not as relevant to this point here. But after World War II, you have a few superpowers emerge. France and Britain had suffered heavily as a result of World War II, and this kind of coincided with the collapse of their own colonial systems because they started losing colonial territories, and so you see a great retraction in Europe of the powers here. Russia ended up doing pretty well in the war. They claimed much of, well, it's I'll say pretty well because they lost. The Russians suffered heavy casualties and losses during World War II, but consistent with the philosophy of communist rule, loss of life wasn't seen as negative of an impact as it might in Western countries. It's kind of an odd thing here. But economically, they ended up retaining quite a bit of Eastern Europe. In the United States, you've got this booming post-war economy. So if you are familiar with the term baby boomers, that's essentially referring to the fact that after World War II, many soldiers came back home, they started families, and the children that were born during that era and the years that followed are generally referred to as the baby boom generation. American industrial manufacturing largely took off during this time period. We saw the expansion of the U.S. middle class to levels that had sort of never been seen before here. And we were one of the leading, superpowers in terms of technological advancement. A lot of that was actually investments that were made as a part of the war effort. So following World War II, similar to the end of World War I, there was very much a feeling, particularly in Europe, that we need to form an organization that will prevent this from happening again in the future. So you end up having the charter for what becomes the United Nations drafted in 1945, actually right before the end of the war in Japan, and it began with 50 member states. The UN was designed, excuse me, really to continue the legacy of the League of Nations, wanted to maintain global peace, but was also very cognizant of the mistakes that the League of Nations had made there. Currently, the UN maintains membership from 193 global states, which is pretty much nearly every country on the planet. If you look at the notable exceptions here, Taiwan. So we'll talk about Taiwan in this class, and that is sort of an emerging situation, or has been over the last, really 18 months, if you will. Not recognized by China, so that's largely why they're not a member state of the UN. Palestine, as we've talked about, last week, and why they're sort of excluded, and then Vatican City, so where the Pope lives, is not generally considered a member, although they actually have a delegation that attends UN events and meetings on their behalf. So covered a lot of history and skipped even more history than we covered here, but there's a few kind of key takeaways that I want you to pull from this lecture here that are important. One, nationalism has grown as a source of international conflict with the creation of new nation states. So the more countries that were formed, the more nationalism you saw sort of grow. So really over the last 300 years, that's largely been a factor in most major international conflicts. The earliest forms of intergovernmental agreements, failed for the most part, and largely this was a result of their inability to actually enforce anything. So the thing with contracts and agreements is that you have to be able to enforce it. The League of Nations did not maintain the military might as an entity to be able to do that, and they failed as a result. International agreements are heavily dependent upon superpower states ceding power for the sake of global interest. And again, this is something foreshadowing here, because we're going to explore this more as we go into more detail, particularly about the United Nations. This notion that you have to get a very powerful state to be able to give up some of its own sovereignty, because you've convinced them that doing so is in their best interest long term, and that can be very complex. And the global appetite for international cooperation, is largely heavily tied to economic circumstances. There's the saying that a rising tide raises all ships, right? So if the economy is going well, and the world economy is benefiting as a result in each member state, cooperation is a lot more likely to occur. When economies are on, particularly in democratic societies where people look for someone to blame, and it creates political opportunities, particularly for minority groups. We know in the United States, that presidential elections are largely sort of an evaluation of the state of the economy a couple of quarters before the election there. So the incumbent president, if the economy is doing well, will benefit from that. If it's not doing so well, they won't. Same thing sort of happens on a global scale. So that was really sort of, like I said, cherry picking a lot of world history there to pull out some sort of interesting tidbits related to a couple big things. Like I said, nationalism, and then the very sort of early origins of intergovernmental organizations, which will be a major theme kind of in this class moving forward here. So hope you enjoyed that. I know that was a lot of information. I sort of blasted you with it there the best I could with a soundtrack over my head here, but hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you for the next one. Thanks so much. Have a great one.